Okay, so yes, this morning I'd like to speak to you about caring for the poor. When Helen asked me to, on Monday, if I was able to preach, I thought, I know what I'm going to preach about, such and such. But then she said the theme that you've been going through over the last few weeks about what it means to be church, and I felt, well, that's not right, but this is. Now this, if you like, subject came about as a result of a conversation I had with a friend of mine. 2 or 3 weeks ago, we went back to Winchester, stayed overnight with some good friends, and we're just talking about churches as we do. And I knew the church back in Winchester had recently seen quite some good growth. And I also knew from several years back that they were involved in CAP, Christians Against Poverty. And as we were talking, he said it was that work with the poor, with people in need, in debt, that made a lot of difference to the church. Not only had it increased numerically, but it had changed the whole tenor of the church. Now, if you know Winchester, if you visited it at all, especially the cathedral, you will know that Winchester is a very affluent society. It's very well-to-do, a lot of influential people. And when we were there, we finding people felt unable to join the church. They picked up this, if you like, that affluent thing with the church. Although there were many other people there, but that seemed to be the overriding thing. Andrew and myself, we lived 26 years in a council house on a council estate, so we were nowhere near affluent. But it was just his whole thing about working with the poor that he said has changed that church, changed the whole tenor, changed the whole flavour of the church. And that stuck with me as quite an eye-opener, really. There's a major shift in that church, and they're 3, 4, probably nearly 500 people now. And it was just wonderful to hear, and just some stories about people's lives who've been changed because church members had shown that they were caring for them. So there are lots of scriptures dealing with the poor. All the way through the Bible, God's heart is for the poor. And here's one from Leviticus. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time to pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. Already this demonstrating God's heart for people and leaving stuff for people to come along afterwards. And this is in Ruth. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. If you know the story of Ruth, she goes out into the fields to gather what was left over. And this is Boaz saying to her, just follow after the men and they will make sure there's stuff there for you to pick up. And then this is talking about Jesus in Luke 61. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free. And here is a prophetic word regarding Jesus when he was coming, and that's reiterated in Luke chapter 4 when he is in the temple. He's given the scroll of Isaiah to read, and he finds a place where it is written about himself. Then finally, here in Galatians, this is Paul talking. All they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I had been eager to do all along. So here is Paul again reiterating his heart for the poor and the work that he was keen to do. For when I was hungry, you gave me something to drink or something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did you see a stranger invite you in, or needed clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" And then the king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for the least of these, brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." And here is a story, a parable that Jesus is teaching, again reiterating God's heart for the poor. Whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me. And it's a wonderful thing to bear in mind, that whatever we do for the least of people, we're doing it for Jesus. We're doing it for God. So I remember a while ago, someone preached, I think it was a visiting speaker, preached in our church back in Bridport. And he said about categories of poor. And I'd never thought of that before. And yet he reiterated or highlighted some. So there are economically poor. And I think that's the first place we go to, really. When you think about the poor, we think about those who are struggling with income or no income at all. And here is an example from 2 Kings with Elisha. And he finds this widow. And he says, "What can I do for you?" And she says, "My husband is dead. You know that your servant honoured the Lord with fear, but the man to whom he owed money has come to take my 2 children to make them serve him." Elisha said to her, "What can I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house?" And she said, "Your woman servant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil." Then he said, "Go around and get jars from all your neighbours. Get empty jars, many of them. Then go in and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour the oil into these jars and set each side that each one is full." So she went from him and shut the door behind her and her sons. They took the jars to her and she poured. When the jars were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another jar." And then he said to her, "There is not one jar left." Then the oil stopped flowing. She came and told the man of God, and he said, "Go and sell the oil and pay what you owe. You and your sons can live on the rest." That's a wonderful story of God's provision of a poor widow. And there are many, many stories like this throughout the Bible. And many people can tell you their own personal story, how God has provided with things that we need. I think I've got time for the egg and chips story. The egg and chips story. When I was a firefighter, the wages weren't very good. And we were struggling with a mortgage. We had 2 or 3 sons. I'm not sure where we are in that, but we had not very much in the cupboard. And Angela just said, I think she said to the boys, if we only had egg and chips, we'd be happy. Well, not long after that, next door neighbour knocks on the door. She says, "Oh, do you want some eggs? My husband has bought a tray of eggs, 2.5 dozen, and there was only 2 of them." So gave Angela some eggs. A little later that morning, my stepmother, Angela's mother-in-law, rang up and said, "Do you want a bag of chips?" Dad's gone and got the wrong chips. We wanted the oven chips. He's gone and got the deep frying ones. So she ran round and egg and chips. We had egg and chips. That's a God's provision. That is a provision of God in a very practical way. And that is the way he is. Moving on quickly then. Relationally poor. This is for people who have trouble forming relationships, holding down relationships. And I'll put up there the example of the woman at the well. If you know the story, Jesus meets a woman at the well. And in the dialogue, eventually he says, "Well, go and call your husband." And she says, "I have no husband." And Jesus says, "You're right when you say you have no husband. In actual fact, you have had 5 husbands, and the man you're living with now isn't your husband." She had trouble holding down relationships. And I know there's probably a lot of stuff surrounding that, but there are people in society who struggle to maintain relationships. And then there's emotionally poor. And I've used a woman caught in adultery as an example. She could have also been said to be relationally poor. But here she had issues with emotions, and something was wrong in her marriage, and so she hooked up with another man, trying to get what she needed. Her emotions were all over the place. And so there are people who have this problem with emotions, trying to get a grip on things, and they find it so much difficult. And then there's the employably poor, those who struggle to find work, and that is widespread, that people struggle finding work. It's all right, the government's coming up with statistics and say, well, there's this million people unemployed, there's this million jobs, we've not got a problem. But it is, because those people may not be skilled enough to meet those needs. Then there's the health poor. Goes without saying, the NHS spending billions and billions on our health, and there are people who really struggle with health. A friend of ours had a bike accident over in Turkey. He lives in Turkey, he's an evangelist over there, and he had to have an operation on his back, and now he's laid up trying to get over that. That's just a small incident, but the implications could have been quite serious, especially with injuries to the back. And then there is spiritually poor, and blessed are the poor in heaven, in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. This is Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes. Blessed are those poor in spirit. And that is all those who are outside of Jesus, outside of Christ, are poor in spirit. So I've gone on to community engagement. I'm going to give some examples, practical ways that we can perhaps engage with people who might be classed as poor. I'm thinking about the whole list of those. And first of all, it begins in the church. We look after each other. If you know people who are struggling, know people who are perhaps not economically poor. We have had bags of food left outside our front door. When we were struggling, people in the church found out, and we had bags of food left on the front, not left on the front door, but knock on the door. Absolutely broken us. The kindness of God in amongst people in our own church. There are practices already in existence, food banks, community fridges. There's many initiatives going on in towns, villages, cities. It's been on the news as well, and it's really horrendous, the poverty that people are going through. And these initiatives, they're not all church initiatives, but they are in the community, and we can get involved with them perhaps. The Waffle House, Axminster, if you've ever been there, you'll know it's not just a food place, a cafe. They do a tremendous amount in the community, and on their walls there's all sorts of information that they're doing there. And I found this on their website, and it says, we are on a mission to fight loneliness and unwantedness by equipping communities with the opportunities, motives and skills to have more naturally adventurous conversations. And they just have so much going on, recognizing loneliness is a real issue, and relationships, a whole thing there. And they're really doing a massive amount of work. And incidentally, they are hoping to open another outlet in Lyme Regis later in the year. The post office closed down last year, I think it was. Someone has bought that, and the Waffle House is hoping to open that again. It'll be a different scenario because Axminster is Axminster, Lyme Regis is Lyme Regis. And yet there's so much need in that small town. Community kitchen. Back in our church in Bridport, one of our people had a real heart for people on the streets. And there's quite a few people just living on the streets. And he wanted to start a soup kitchen. And we allowed him to use the actual church building. And he set it up, funded it all himself, got some volunteers, and it got off the ground. And that was about 4 or 5 years ago. It's now developed more into a community kitchen, and the other Friday we heard they fed 35 people. That's a wonderful work, and it's been in the paper, the local papers, and it's done a wonderful work there, meeting people, those who sleep rough in amongst, in the streets or wherever. And we had several of them come into the church for our services, just somewhere to be warm. And yet we befriended them, and they were grateful for it. We just loved them, not without trying to get anything from them. And yes, we'd love them to become Christians, but mainly the first protocol is meet their practical needs. Feed them, give them clothing, blankets, sleeping bags. Just meet their immediate needs. And as I say, it's moved on, it's grown over the years. So one lady called Karen, there is another church in Bridport that does a lunch on Monday lunchtimes. And Angela and I went there one Monday to take some of the sort of necessary toiletries, socks, stuff like that. And we went to join with them, and they invited us to stay for lunch. And one of the women there was called Karen. And Angela got on really well with her because they were both interested in art. And so there was a common bond there. Later in the week, we saw Karen again, and he just said, if you want to come to our church, we're there, told her where it was. She came on Sunday morning, and in the door, Angela was on the door that morning, and Karen said to her, I want to pray the sinner's prayer. Just like that. And Angela led her to the Lord there and then. Absolutely wonderful. This woman who was just a couple of years younger than Angela. And she did have her home place, but her quality of living was very poor. And that morning I was preaching, and I preached on the Father Heart of God. And I talked about if people had problems relating to God as Father or Daddy, relate to him as a Papa God. And this spoke to Karen so much. And we saw her a few weeks later. She says, oh, I still love Papa God. And then COVID hit. And within a few weeks, Karen had died. But she'd gone into glory. Didn't get baptized, didn't become a church member, but she went into glory because she gave her heart to the Lord. Jerry, another guy who had quite a poor standard of living. Again, he had his own place, but he came to our church for several years and just loved being there with us. And we got to know him, and I used to meet him for coffee or breakfast. And he had quite a sad tale to tell. He'd been married. He and his wife had several miscarriages and a stillbirth. And probably after 10 years of marriage, his wife died. I don't know the reason, but that was his story. And then he got into drug taking, and his life went downhill even further. But he came to our church, and we just loved him as he was. Great character, lovely guy. And we went on a church weekend over in Seaton, Peacehaven. And the Saturday morning we had our first meeting, and the Holy Spirit just came upon him. He was on the floor most of the meeting. He got up, God had met with him. Had the joy of baptizing him a few months later. And then COVID hit and he died. It is sad, but I'm just showing you to love people where they are, as they are. Yes, they may be smelly. Yes, they may be dirty. They may not have good table manners. But these are the people Jesus was in. The people Jesus met. And you can read so many of his stories through the Gospels. And that was where Jesus was. Right there, in with the messiness of people's lives. And that's where he was. Just quickly this morning, Andrew and I, in our daily readings, we were looking at Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch in the book of Acts. And he meets with Philip. And Philip, instead of saying, come to church, come and see us at church, he didn't. He jumps up in the wagon and he helps the Ethiopian eunuch. He's reading from Isaiah 53. And straight away, Philip leads him to the Lord. And this is just something that's really been speaking to me over the last few months, that we as churches haven't been really taught to lead people to Jesus out in the streets, out wherever we meet them. The mantra has really been, bring them to church. Get them to come to church. And yet, you read through the Gospels, you read through the book of Acts. They were brought to Jesus. They met Jesus where they were. And then they came to church. And it's just really quite an eye-opener for us as churches. And these examples that I've said about, and there are many around the world, of people who've been led to Jesus out where they are, rather than getting them to come to church. Food banks, I've said about that. Community fridge, a glut stall, that started a couple of years ago. People had a lot more fruit and veg than they needed in their gardens, and so they set up a stall at one of the churches. And that has mushroomed, sorry, excuse the pun, but it has grown significantly. And it just shows again the need there is in our communities. I am a trustee of something called Pathways to Care in Bridport that provides really hospital transport, but also emergency food parcels for maybe 3 days. And that's going on quietly in the background. And we hear all sorts of things about the need there is in our own town. And I'm guessing Honiton is no different. Children and young carers. As one of the trustees, we hear all sorts of stories, and one of them was that a school became aware that there were children who were young carers for brothers or sisters or maybe parents. And one of their jobs was to do the shopping. Well, when they didn't have much money, they couldn't get much food and shopping. And so the community, the food bank in town, heard about this, and they started opening after 4 o'clock on a couple of days a week so that the children could go there and get food for their families. One of my grandsons has Down syndrome. He's 3.5. His older sister is 6. The school they go to recognise these young carers, and they do several little events just to recognise that there are children, even at 5 and 6, who have a form of caring role within the family. She loves her brother to bits, annoys him because she gets on to him and hugs him to bits, but she is a young carer. And that school has recognised that, because that could affect her schooling, certainly some of her moods or something in the classroom on a particular day. And the teachers are aware of what is happening in the background. And as I've said about the church in Winchester, it changes our perspectives. It changes our churches. It makes a difference when we start caring for the poor and getting involved. And it's a wonderful work that's going on. So that's what I want to bring to you this morning. Hope that's been helpful. And just see what God does with it if you bring it to the Lord.